we have to, maybe every year or two, we occasionally have to change a password. We had to change it last year. And I think I hadn't changed it 2 years before that. They don't want us getting comfortable and, you know, wanting to make sure that we don't get hacked and stuff. Okay. So we are going to have a review session on Tuesday. That is going to be in person in the student lounge. So right over there with all the comfy chairs. Does anybody have a particular time that they want it? Also, Dr. Gilchrist needs to eat. So please don't make it like 5:30 or something. I need to eat dinner. How does 6:30 or 7 o'clock sound? Who's for 6:30? Who's for 7? Okay. Who could easily do both? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and pick 6:30 because I saw more hands there. So tomorrow night at 6:30, we will meet in the student lounge. I am hoping that this exam is a little bit easier for you than the last one. I would also remind you, I set up practice quizzes for chapters 5, 6, and 7, which are going to be on the test, that you can take and retake to give you an opportunity to get exposed to potential test questions. The practice quizzes come from the same pool that the test questions come from, so be aware. All right. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about memory. So the last time we were here, we were talking a little bit about the multi-store model of memory and the different stores that are present. So we talked about short-term sensory memory. We are talking about short-term memory, and now we're going to move into long-term memory. All right, so as I kind of mentioned last time, one of the interesting things about short-term memory is that as it was originally conceived, it was basically designed to be a short-term memory buffer. So buffer is a computer term. We are in cognitive psychology now, and cognitive psych gained a lot of its vocabulary and a lot of its early theoretical models from computer science. So a buffer in computer science is basically a little short-term store area. You know how sometimes when you go on the internet, you occasionally have to clean out your temporary internet files or clear out your cookies? You should be doing that. That keeps the viruses away. But usually those are stored in a small little buffer. And basically the whole point of a buffer is that you can store them there temporarily, or eventually you can get rid of them and they'll be lost forever. So the original conception of short-term memory was that it held information for a short period of time, but you couldn't actually do anything with it. And it was either going to stay there until it got bumped out by something else and thus lost forever, or it could move into long-term memory. Now, as of 1974, Alan Badley and Graham Hitch actually came up with a newer way of thinking about short-term memory that we actually refer to as working memory. Now, I'm not going to go through this little theoretical model that is presented down here. What you basically need to know for this is that you can manipulate information in short-term memory. So for example, can anybody tell me, using mental arithmetic, so you got to do some mental math here, can somebody tell me what 12 times 13 is? Try it in your head. Yeah? Oh, okay. I thought I heard somebody say it. It's 156. It's 156. But when you're engaged in that mental math, you have to process information and multiply it. You have to hold intermediate values in mind. Occasionally when I see people do this, they kind of work with their hands too, because they're trying to carry over previous items. But the idea here is that when you look at something like mental arithmetic or mental math, you're not just holding information in your short-term memory. You are actually in the process of manipulating it. So Badley and Hitch basically did over 12 different studies. You can trust me on this. I had to read it for my comprehensive exams before they would let me try for a PhD. I had to read a lot of papers. And we actually manipulate information and we link it with long-term memory. And we do this through this proposed working memory system. So we have an area that holds information in a speech-based code. You don't need to write this down. I'm not going to test you on it. You just need to know what working memory is. We have an area that holds information in a speech-based code. We have another area that processes patterns and visual information that we cannot convert into a speech-based code. And we have this buffer that actually links information from long-term memory with working memory. So if you want to be really technical, I have often told people I'm a short-term memory researcher, but that is not technically true. I am a working memory researcher. I am interested in the role that attention plays in working memory and how this changes throughout the lifespan. All right. I already gave you that list of words last week where I gave you that false memory. I just couldn't wait. I'm that person who buys Christmas presents early and then's like, come on, open your present now. I don't care if it's November. I want you to see. So I couldn't help myself and I wanted to do it. And so when you didn't need to write that down. You didn't need to write that down. That was for a demonstration. So one of the things that you may have found when I gave you that list of words is that you actively had to do work to try to remember it. So I'm really sorry to say this. I am not necessarily trying to crush your dreams, but if you want to do well in this class, you can't just put the textbook under your pillow at night, go to sleep, and just hope that the words will just magically, passively diffuse into your brain. It doesn't work that way. You have to actively engage with material if you want to remember it. And you do so with conscious, controlled effort, and it does require attention. So this is what is referred to as effortful processing. So sometimes when we need to make a memory, we have to process it effortfully. And this is something that requires our conscious awareness, and thus it also requires our attention. So this is often going to happen. And yes, I know that there's automatic processing. I'm kind of switching it up a little bit. I want to talk about effortful processing first. So this is often going to be used when information that we're getting is either new or it's not very interesting to us. And we kind of have to force ourselves to learn it. For many of you, that might be in your math classes. Well, I like math, but I also know a lot of people do not like math. So when we're trying to learn new skills, our processing is effortful as well. Think about the first time that you learned to drive a car with your learner's permit. How did it go? That's a lot of different stuff you have to try to remember. It's a lot of different things you have to pay attention to. I almost confused the gas and the brake and ran into my mom's apartment building. I'm a great driver. I am now. I would recommend, especially depending on like your training, I cannot recommend getting driving lessons as an adult enough. I am a better driver because I got driving lessons at 26. Okay. Now, for you to actually engage in effortful processing, you might have to engage in rehearsal. And this is what many of you did last week when I gave you that list of words to remember, right? You started repeating things to yourself. So I believe the first word was sugar, or something like that. It was sugar, heart, tooth, tart, or something like that. So you get the first word, you go sugar, sugar, sugar. Then you get heart. You go sugar, heart, sugar, heart. Then you get tooth, sugar, heart, tooth, sugar, heart, tooth. So it's almost like you're juggling each item. And as I kind of mentioned, what many of us find is that that gets to be too much after a point. We basically throw all the balls in the air and we go, okay, that's too hard. I'm just going to listen. And that's what most people do when they get lists of words. So rehearsal is when you are consciously repeating information to yourself. Now, oftentimes there are things that you have memories of that you are not consciously trying to store. So for example, oftentimes we will find, how many of you are like me? I drive somewhere once. I may not necessarily know the street names or things like that, but if I've been there once, I actually have a pretty good chance that I'm going to remember how to get there in the future. Now, I'm not talking about long distances. I'm talking about in town. So when I was in Atlanta, I would always go to try to find new restaurants, new shops. Once I went there the first time, I would remember how to get there in the future without using a GPS to help me. So this is something that many of us do. We're able to encode spatial location without doing conscious processing of this information. So many of you have learned since the first day of classes how to get to this room. How many of you spent time consciously being like, okay, now I'm going to turn left and then I'm going to turn right. And then the classroom is right next to the student lounge. Maybe some of you did that, but most of you didn't. Once you found the room, it's almost like your brain automatically processed it for you. So we often do this with spatial locations. We can actually make a spatial map. We also do this with time. So we have a pretty good idea of what time of day something happened to us without being like, okay, this happened in the afternoon. I will remember this. We don't do that. We're able to unconsciously encode the time that something happens. We also do this with frequency. So for example, how many of you have an instructor, either current or previous, that kept saying the same phrase or the same word over and over again? Okay, one of mine is basically. And so sometimes students notice that I say basically a lot. I had a professor in graduate school who would always go, what else hit you? And so I would somehow or other realize, hey, he's saying that a lot. And I didn't necessarily try to encode exactly how often I heard him say it, but my brain was keeping track of the frequency without me actually making an effort to learn it. So these are all things that we do automatically without doing a lot of conscious processing, and they don't even necessarily require a lot of attention. And because of this, because it is automatic, it can be really difficult for us to shut it off because it's not controlled. So I want to get back to effortful processing really quick. So, you know, the best way to study for my tests, start studying as soon as you can. Generally, we are going to find that the more that you study something, the better your memory for that thing is going to be. This is what is referred to as the total time hypothesis. The more that you study with something, the more you engage in something, the better your memory for that will be. So what you are looking at here is data from work by Hermann Ebbinghaus. Now, a lot of what we know about memory as well as forgetting is due to the work of Ebbinghaus. So Ebbinghaus, he actually did research studies that we do not do today. In particular, not because they were unethical, but because he made himself his own subject. He studied himself. So this was long before we actually had established protocols for running experiments. And so what he did was he would learn these long lists of words, nonsense syllables that were typically made of a consonant, a vowel, and another consonant. So sometimes we call these CVCs, consonants, vowels, consonants. So he would basically repeat a list of these items a certain number of times. So for example, you can kind of follow my cursor here. He would repeat a list between 8 times all the way up to 64 times. Would you ever want to do this on yourself? I wouldn't. And then the next day, he would basically see how long it took him to relearn each of those lists. And he found that the more repetitions on day 1, the less time it took to relearn it on day 2. So something that he only repeated 8 times took about 20 minutes to learn. Something he repeated 64 times took almost a little bit over 5 minutes to learn. So if you want to remember something for later, it is critical to actually study it. And the more that you study it, the better your performance will hopefully be. Okay. Everybody good here? Okay. So here's another important study tip for you. So raise your hands. Be honest with me. How many of you crammed? Like you study for a test the night before? Okay. Raise your hand and no judgment here. How many of you crammed for my test? Hey, there is no shame in that. I was a college student once. I crammed too. But I will tell you this. How many of you have had this experience? You cram for a test, you come in to take the test, you do pretty well, and then almost as if by magic, all of the information basically leaves your head as soon as you're done taking the test. Like, how many of you crammed for my test? And as like, if I asked you about Piaget's stages of development, you're having trouble thinking of them right now. That is okay. That's what cramming does to you. It works in the short term, but it's not very good over the long term. So if you're thinking about taking the cumulative final, don't cram. You're going to need that information for later, and you're going to have an easier time remembering that information if you actually space out your studying. I never liked to cram just because, have you met me? I have a lot of nervous energy, and I always like to be in motion. So the idea of sitting in my room, in my dorm, for like 5 hours trying to study for a test just seemed so unappealing to me. So what I would do was I would say, okay, I've got 5 days until the test. I'm going to study for 1 hour every day. And kind of bear in mind, my classes had like 200 students. My professors didn't do study sessions or anything like that. And so what you will find, this is what is called spaced practice. Sometimes it's also referred to as distributed practice. You distribute your studying over a longer period of time. So break your studying up into smaller sections of time. Now, we are 2 days away from the exam. So if you haven't started studying yet, well, you might have to cram a little bit. And I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry that I'm only introducing this to you now, but I'm telling you this because it works. There are numerous studies that back this finding up. I do not list them here, but if you're curious, I have them. So memory is generally going to be better for the long-term period if your studying and rehearsal are spread out over time instead of doing it all at once. Additionally, some of y'all may not like the quizzes that I give you, but I do them for a reason. It turns out that when you test yourself and you quiz yourself, that actually improves your memory performance above and beyond just studying. So there's a really well-known study, I believe it's Roediger and Karpicki, but it's either from 2006 or 2007. I just talked about it in Cognitive last week. They either had people study passages or they got little quizzes. And they found that the people who were tested more had better memory performance over the long term than people who just study. So part of the reason that I made those practice quizzes available is that some of you like kind of getting potential exposure to test questions. Additionally, it's another way to help you learn. This is what is referred to as the testing effect, by the way. So if you are interested in learning about more of these different strategies, I would say the work of Roddy Roediger, or Henry Roediger III is typically how he's named in papers, but he goes by Roddy. I would also say work by Jeff Karpicki is good, as well as work by Mark McDaniel. And they all kind of came from the same group of people at Washington University in St. Louis. Okay, so,
I'm sorry.
oh, don't be sorry. You've got nothing to be sorry about. I'm sorry I talk so fast.
No, you switched the slide and I didn't even notice you had switched the slide. So I'm like, oh, oops.
That's okay. If you can believe it, I haven't had any caffeine this morning. I was a little dehydrated yesterday, and it kind of hit me that it might be better if I focus on rehydrating today. I have already had one of these, and I'm already almost halfway through the next one, and a cup of tea. Once I am done with this, I will have caffeine. Haley, I just got your email. You want to talk to me after class? Okay. We can be pretty quick. You'll be all right. I got you covered. So as we are kind of continuing to write stuff down, so I want you to go back to the list of items that we talked about on Friday. So I kind of polled everybody. I asked you if you remembered the items from the beginning of the list pretty well, and a lot of you did. I asked you if you remembered the items from the end of the list pretty well, and most of you did. And then I asked if anybody had a couple of items from the middle of the list, and that's kind of where things got a little dicey. So it turns out when you are allowed to recall list items in any order that you want, it turns out we get a very characteristic curve. This is what is called the serial position effect. And what you're looking at is a serial position curve. Now, what I want you to focus on is the red curve right now. So this is what's called immediate recall. I give you a list of items, and then you immediately have to remember them. So what we find is that when we do immediate recall, people tend to remember the first items of the list very well, and they remember the last items of a list very well. So we actually have names for these. So remembering the first items in a list very well is what is called a primacy effect. When we remember the items from the end of the list well, this is what is called a recency effect. Now, I mentioned on Friday that the primacy effect is largely due to information being in long-term memory, and that the recency effect is due to those last items being in short-term memory. So how do I know this? I know this because it turns out that if I give you a list of items And then I give you a 5-minute break. So maybe I make you do some math problems, maybe I make you read a passage, or I make you talk to somebody else. And then I ask you to recall after that 5-minute break. Here's what happens to your recall. It's basically what happens here in blue. The first items are still recalled relatively well compared to the rest of the list. Now notice that overall performance is worse than an immediate recall. Everything's a bit lower here. That's going to happen. Memory fades over time. The strength of your memories can fade over time. But notice that the first items from the list are still remembered well compared to the rest of the list. But notice that there's no recency effect anymore. So with a 5-minute break, the first items are remembered pretty well, but the recency effect is gone. The reason that this happens is because recency is due to short-term memory. Short-term memory is not able to withstand a 5-minute break. So that's basically going to remove those items from your short-term memory. So that's how we know that long-term memory or the primacy effect is due to you repeating the first item so much that they get into long-term memory. But at some point, rehearsal becomes too much and you stop. So you just focus on listening, and that allows you to grab the last items of the list and put those in short-term memory. And that's how it works. Now, there are different types of memory for the different things that we do. This is my favorite slide in this whole lecture. How many of you are familiar with Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Fantastic. If you're not, some of these jokes will not make sense. But I urge you at an opportunity to go YouTube this scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It is a classic. When I was in 9th grade, me and my friends would rehearse this scene and just repeat it over and over and over. Okay, so I want you to imagine you are on a quest for the Holy Grail. Cool. That's a bit of an understatement. So you're going with all of your friends and you find a bridge keeper. The bridge keeper says you are not allowed to pass this bridge unless you answer these questions 3. And if you fail to answer them, he's going to throw you off of the bridge and you're basically going to fall into a pit of fire. So here's the first question that he asks you. What is the capital of Assyria? This is actually from the movie. Okay, so here's something kind of interesting about this question. This is a memory for a fact. This is the kind of thing that you would get if you were playing trivia or watching Jeopardy or playing Trivia Pursuit. It is a fact. Here are some other things that are facts. What is 2 plus 2? What is your favorite color? Technically, that's a fact. Your favorite color should be a fact. Even if it changes, still a fact. So when you remember facts, this is a type of long-term memory that we call semantic memory. So semantic memory is basically general knowledge like vocabulary. It's also knowledge of things about the world. So facts. So it's how I can tell the difference between the word obsequious and the word ubiquitous. Thank you, AP English. Now, for those who do not know, and I had to look this up, the capital of Assyria at the time was Assur. So we get that question correct. Great. So next, you get this question. What did you have for breakfast yesterday? This is a different type of question, right? So we had a question about a fact. Now we have a question about something that happened to us at a particular time point. This is episodic memory. So here's an important distinction between semantic memory and episodic memory. Can you remember what you did yesterday? A little bit? How many of you are having the conscious experience of seeing that in your mind? You're going, you're consciously going back through your mind and you're trying to remember the different things you did. Okay, so you can actually find the source of that memory. That's the source. That's where the memory originates from. Here's a question. How many of you remember the exact day that you learned that 2 + 2 is 4? Nobody, right? So here's what's interesting about facts. They get repeated so often and across so many different places that at some point you demonstrate that you have this fact in mind because you are able to report that 2 + 2 is 4, but you can't consciously go back and find the source. Maybe you can say to yourself, well, I was probably in preschool, or I watched Sesame Street or something like that, but it's not going to be as clear as you thinking about what you ate at brunch yesterday, for example. Does that make sense? So semantic memory typically will lack a source. Episodic memory has a source that you can consciously search for. An episodic memory, because you are able to consciously find that source, is often referred to as mental time travel. Now, there's a big difference between trivial little things like what you had for breakfast yesterday and big important events that happen in your life, like graduating high school or graduating here from Kadi. Those are big events that are important to your life narrative. And so they are a type of memory called autobiographical memory. So episodic memory tends to be for trivial things. How did you do on your run yesterday, Dr. Gilchrist? Well, I was in the basement and it was disgusting. Can you, because I was really sweaty. Can you tell us about the day that you got your PhD? Yes. The day I successfully defended my dissertation, I ate way too many donuts before, and I was basically in a sugar coma until about halfway through my presentation. And then I made them ask, and then I made my committee call me doctor 3 times before I believed it. And then they were like, you got it already, quit asking. One of those events is very trivial. The other is important to my life story. It's important to my history and my life narrative. Autobiographical memories are those important events. Episodic memories tend to be a little bit more trivial. Generally, the fate of your universe and your life does not hinge on what you had for breakfast. If it has, I apologize. Okay, so we tried to get into brunch, but Robbie doesn't like to scan my ID card, even though I'm allowed to have brunch. So I went home and I made pumpkin pancakes instead. So not a bad breakfast, but that's what I had yesterday. So we get that question correct. So we're doing great. We've got 2 out of 3 questions we've answered, right? We're doing well. And then the bridge keeper asks this: how do you ride a bicycle? Now, I know what some of you are going to think. Why don't you just show him? Or say, you put your hands on the handlebars, you put your feet on the pedals, and you try to balance yourself. No, I'm talking about the specific, conscious, how do you ride a bike with all of the balancing and the pedaling and the muscle memory that it entails. Are you going to be able to put all of that into words? No. And at this point, we are all thrown off the bridge and put into the pit of fire. Okay. So here's the thing. Remembering how to do different types of skills is a different type of memory. It is called a procedural memory. So we're going to talk about a major distinction on the next slide. You do not need to write this down because we'll get there. Semantic memory, an episodic memory, an autobiographical memory are what are known as declarative memories. You demonstrate that you have these memories by telling people. You can tell people. So if you have a memory of what 2 + 2 is, you should be able to produce the answer 4. If I ask you what you had for breakfast yesterday, you should be able to report a pretty good idea. If I ask you what your high school graduation was like, you should be able to tell me. For something like a skill, You don't demonstrate by telling. You demonstrate by doing or by modifying your behavior. So whereas semantic and episodic and autobiographical memory are referred to as declarative memories, things like skills and procedural memories are what we call non-declarative. You demonstrate them with behavioral change. Everybody good? Okay. So let's talk about a little bit more about this distinction between declarative and non-declarative memory. So it turns out we have other names for declarative versus non-declarative. So we also call declarative memories explicit memories. These require conscious awareness. You actively have to consciously engage in the process of searching for something to report the answer. So this will include both semantic and episodic memory, as well as autobiographical. Now, here's what's really critical. We haven't really talked about this yet. We have a part of our brain called the hippocampus. It's a curvy little seahorse just on the inside of your temporal lobes. The hippocampus is often very important for binding information together. So things like how you were feeling, what you were seeing, where you were. The hippocampus is going to bind all of this information together to help make a memory. So the hippocampus is going to be critical for forming explicit memories. And we know this because when you look at people who have had their hippocampus damaged or removed through surgery, they are not good at forming new explicit memories. They're not. They can, so you can walk in to the room of somebody who's had hippocampal damage, shake their hand, come back 5 minutes later, they won't remember that they met you. They're basically Dory from Finding Nemo. They can't convert that short-term information into long-term. And the hippocampus is going to be a really big part of that process. Now, on the other hand, implicit memory or non-declarative memory does not need conscious awareness. I don't need to have conscious retrieval of how to do the robot. I just do it. I'm not consciously remembering the steps. I just move my arms, I move my body, I change my behavior. So procedural memory is non-declarative. Now, here's what's important. You don't need a functioning hippocampus to learn procedural memories. These procedural memories often occur in areas like the cerebellum, which is right here just above the brainstem. Areas like the cerebellum are going to be really important for learning new skills. And because of that, people with amnesia, even though they can't form new declarative memories, they can learn new skills. So in my office, there's a puzzle that has a bunch of discs sitting on pegs. This is sometimes referred to as the Tower of Hanoi task or the Tower of London task. And the idea with this puzzle is to move all of the discs from one peg all the way to the other peg at the very end of the puzzle. And the rules are you can only move one disc at a time. You can't put a larger disc on top of the smaller disc. And at least with my puzzle, to be able to do this correctly, you have to make 128 correct moves to solve it. If you make a mistake, it's going to take more than 128. But what's interesting is that somebody with amnesia, every time you put this puzzle in front of them, they will get better and better It'll take them less time to solve it. They'll make fewer mistakes. But if you ask them if they've ever done this before, what are they going to tell you? They're going to assume they're going to tell you they've never seen it before, because their memory of doing the puzzle is an episodic memory. Them actually doing the puzzle is a procedural memory. One thing they have, the other they do not. So now let's talk about other things that we can do to help us remember things better. And I would say that in addition to studying and breaking your studying into sections and testing yourself, is giving information meaning. Make it meaningful. One of the best things I can tell you in psychology is that where you can, you should try to tie as much of these findings and these phenomena to your life. It will make it more meaningful for you, and it might actually make it easier to remember. So one of the things that we're finding, and I'm not actually texting, I'm pulling up something that we're going to need in a minute. So one of the things that we find is that when we remember things, when we remember what somebody has told us, when we remember what somebody has told us, or we get into a fight with somebody, one of the things that we'll find is that in general, we don't remember specific phrasing unless it was really memorable. But we do tend to understand the overall gist of what people are saying. So we get the deeper meaning, even if we do not remember the specific phrasing. And one of the other things that we will find is that our context and our experience with events can actually help us to remember things. So as you're taking these notes, I am going to read a passage to you. Take notes on what you're seeing here. Don't take notes on the passage. Remember, this is not a listening test or a writing test, but I'm just going to read this to you, and I want you to tell me what you think when I'm finished. Okay, the procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo any particular endeavor. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It is difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future, but then one can never tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put in their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. So that was vague, right? Now, if you've read the book, you may already know what the answer is. So does anybody who has not heard this passage yet, does anybody have any thoughts? Like, if I tested your memory on this, how good do you think your memory for the things in this passage would be? Not good at all? So what if I gave you the title? The title is Washing Clothes. And all of a sudden, it makes sense. However, so Bransford and Johnson actually did this with participants. They gave them that vague passage. What we find is that people who were given the title first had a context with which to organize this information. And their memory performance was actually better than people who got the title after, or people who didn't get the title at all. So meaning and context in your experience with things help frame how you remember things. Additionally, we do find that it's easier for us to remember information if it's easy for us to form an image in our mind. People have a much easier time remembering words that they can actually see in their mind, like bottle or bag or apple. They have a harder time with words like freedom or peace. Those are harder to form good images of. Okay, everybody good? All right. Okay, so one more slide and we'll call it a day. And this one's actually going to be on the test, so I'm actually cool with this. So I think it kind of goes without saying that we kind of know that memory has something to do with our brains. So here's a really funny finding that people report. Try to remember something right now. Remember your last birthday? Oftentimes when people try to remember things, where do they look? They look up towards their brain, where their memory tends to be. I just think that's kind of funny. But it turns out that our intuition that memory lies within the brain actually has a really good basis. Forming new memories begins with small little changes in neurons. So remember our neurons? You're like, please don't take me back to the biopsych chapter, Dr. Gilchrist, please. Just for a little bit. I promise it'll be okay. So long-term potentiation was basically discovered to be the process that starts memory formation and learning within the brain. So here's what we know. Now, I am obviously not teaching biopsych next year, but if you want to take biopsych the year after in 2023, we will talk about this at length. But the basic idea here is that a neuron basically becomes better at firing. So we get this increase in a synapse's firing potential. Basically, our postsynaptic neuron becomes a better receiver of information. We get more receptors that can receive information from neurotransmitters. We also get increased serotonin release. So over time, what we find is that neurons basically start to form these networks where where the presynaptic neuron is a better sender of information and the postsynaptic one becomes a better receiver. And as you also know, head injuries and concussions in particular can affect memory formation as well, because with concussions, neurons actually sustain micro damage. The neurons twist and shear, and that can cause memory problems over the long term. So wear a helmet, protect your head. If you have any questions on anything that I did not cover here, make sure to check in your book. Test yourself with the practice quizzes. If you have any questions for me, shoot me an email, and I will see you at the review session tomorrow night, 6:30, Student Lounge.